Greetings all, Ferrariman601 here. Welcome to another 1/18th scale model car review of this, the 2015 McLaren MP430, rendered in 1/18th scale by AutoArt. Yes, the MP430, the McLaren Honda, colloquially known as the McHonda. Yes, this is the car with which McLaren competed in the 2015 Formula One season, which was set to be an all-out stunner. McLaren rejoining forces with Honda for the first time since 1992. Surely this was going to power them to the Constructors' Championship. Well, as history later was the judge, it was determined that the McLaren-Honda combination was going to be one of the most disastrous and comical in all of Formula One history. From 2015 to 2017, McLaren and Honda joining forces there, Honda giving McLaren an exclusive to that point engine supply. It was absolutely terrible. World champions Fernando Alonso and Jenson Button spearheading their championship charge. Well, it was absolutely dreadful. The Honda power unit became one of the most fuel-hungry, least powerful, and least reliable power units on the grid, and they did pretty much nothing of consequence for that 2015 to 2017 tenure with Honda power, did McLaren. It was so bad that McLaren eventually abandoned the traditional nomenclature of MP for their Formula One chassis designations, reverting to MCL for 2017. So the MP430 and MP431 are the last McLarens 2015 and 2016 to be known as MP. That, of course, the merger between McLaren International and Ron Dennis's Project for Racing all the way back in the good old days. The MP430, therefore, it's known as the GP2 car, basically, of Formula One. Those comments made famous by Fernando Alonso, specifically at Suzuka in 2015, in which he lamented the abject lack of engine power in a straight line. Other good comments from Fernando Alonso in that era: amazing. Less power than before, even slower than before, embarrassing, we're like amateurs, and of course, GP2 engine, GP2, ugh. So, there it was. The McLaren Honda in 1/18th scale. Why do we have this car? Well, basically, it's just to have a bit of a laugh. Let's take a look at what AutoArt have done with this car, take a look at the competition history, and just basically reminisce at a bygone era of McLaren doing McLaren things. Yes, the McLaren MP430. All of the very bad and beaten to death dead horse jokes aside, what is this car and why has it become the meme that it has become? Well, one needs to look no farther than to the tenure of Fernando Alonso with McLaren. Alonso returning to McLaren for the first time since his one and only season with them to date in 2007, wherein he really should have become world champion for the third time. However, Alonso, amid a plethora of external factors such as his relationship with the new team and specifically his relationship with the team's new acquisition, second driver Lewis Hamilton. There's an obscure name. I wonder whatever happened with Lewis Hamilton. Alonso just could not keep it on the island, and he let his ego get the better of him. Talk about Hungary qualifying that year, where he had this miraculously minute-and-a-half long pit stop, which just so happened to keep Hamilton from getting his last qualifying lap in. And then a crash at Fuji, and then just generally a whole bunch of really bad sportsmanship, which ultimately netted Alonso no more championships in his Formula One career. Well, he was looking to put all of that right in 2015, returning to his beloved McLaren and partnering up with Honda. McLaren partnering up with Honda for the first time since the end of 1992, and of course, in 1992, it was the end of a glorious spell of world championships. Most famously, the championships for Ayrton Senna with Honda power, 1988, 1990, and 1991. Of course, the absolutely legendary MP44 chassis, which won 15 out of 16 races in 1988, still the most dominant Formula One car in all of Grand Prix history. Honda power, and a Honda V6 in that car, no less. This car, exactly the same then as the MP44, with a Honda V6 underneath that engine cover. Specifically, the installed power in this car was the Honda RA615H. It was Honda's first foray into this current turbo hybrid engine formula of Grand Prix racing. Rev limited to 15,000 RPM per the regulations. In practice, they don't rev much higher than 11.5 due to fuel flow limits, but there it was, V6 at 90 degrees of the bank angle there, and of course rear wheel drive. In addition to the V6 engine, we also have the hybrid system, which comprises an MGU-H and an MGU-K. Those are electric motors that are also generators, depending on whether or not they are charging or discharging. One of those is run off of the turbocharger, that's the MGU-H, and the other one is the MGU-K, or the motor generator unit kinetic. That is run more conventionally off of the rear axle, much in the same way that the initial Formula One KERS systems operated, those 2009 through 2013 KERS systems that we saw before the turbo hybrid era got underway. The rest of the car, well, pretty much conventional as far as mid-2010s Formula One design is concerned. Carbon fiber monocoque in the construction of this car, just like we've seen in every Formula One car since about the mid-1980s. Front suspension, as you can see there as it spins around, double wishbone push rod up front, and it's a double wishbone suspension in the rear as well, but it is a pull rod setup on the rear. And again, that is a design trait that we've been seeing on Formula One cars basically since this era and to this date forevermore. The overall dimensions on the MP430 are as follows. Overall length, as we saw it here in pretty much initial launch spec and early season spec, 5,100 millimeters. Later on, and this is the version of the car that we have in iRacing with a slightly updated thumbnail nose, the length shortened a little bit to 5,070 millimeters. Width on the car, 1,800 millimeters exactly. That was homologated in the regulations. Height, 950 millimeters. Wheelbase, 3,520 millimeters, and that was adjustable plus or minus 20 millimeters, or just about 1 inch. The transmission linking up that turbo hybrid V6 Honda engine to the driven wheels. That's a McLaren designed and manufactured 8-speed plus reverse semi-automatic gearbox, paddle actuated via the steering wheel, of course. The other part of the hybrid powertrain in this car, the battery packs, those are all Honda designed and manufactured lithium-ion cells, and the conventional mounting place in a Formula One car for those lithium-ion cells is right underneath the fuel tank, which itself is right behind the cockpit, between the rear cockpit bulkhead and the front of the engine. So again, the fuel tank and the batteries being sandwiched between the driver and the engine, trying to get all the heaviest components of the car concentrated pretty much midships so that you can control your center of gravity. Fuel was provided by ExxonMobil via their Esso brand, and of course lubricants provided by Mobil and Mobil 1, as you can see on the graphics there on the engine cover. Very few graphics overall on this car in terms of sponsorship. I wonder why that was the case. Brakes, Akebano carbon discs with your multi-piston calipers up front and at rear. Of course, carbon brakes, par for the course in Formula One these days, and the tires homologated in the technical regulations, Pirelli, the P0 compound for the slick dry weather tire, and the Cinturato tires for the intermediate and wet conditions. Competition history on the MP430. Well, yes, this is where all of the trouble started. Only entered by McLaren Honda in 2015, driven by Fernando Alonso, Jenson Button, and Kevin Magnussen, although poor Kevin Magnussen didn't even manage to get a single race start in this car. Over the course of the 19 races of 2015, the McHonda won 0 of them, took 0 podium finishes, scored 0 pole positions, and scored 0 fastest laps. The car's debut was at the 2015 Australian Grand Prix, and its last race was the 2015 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. 0.0 in terms of its hit rate, in terms of race victories, and it only gets worse when you look at the race-by-race results. Not counting the failure to start for Kevin Magnussen in Australia, what do we have here? The best result for the car all season long was a 5th place in Hungary, courtesy of Fernando Alonso. Unfortunately, that only happened one time. Jenson Button's best result in the car was 6th place at the United States Grand Prix at Circuit of the Americas. The balance of the season looked a little bit like this. Fernando Alonso did not participate in the Australian Grand Prix. Jenson Button finished 11th that day, and Kevin Magnussen failed to make the grid. The Malaysian Grand Prix, the next time out, Alonso returned, and of course Button continuing to drive the other car, a double retirement in Malaysia. That's 2 retirements. Spanish Grand Prix, a retirement for Fernando Alonso, and a 16th for Jenson Button. That's a 3rd retirement. Monaco, a 4th retirement courtesy of Fernando Alonso, and P8 for Jenson Button, first points of the year. Canada, double retirement. Austria, double retirement. Britain, Alonso finishes 10th, his first points of the year, and Button retires. Hungary was a 5th and a 9th for Alonso and Button respectively, so that's the car's cumulative best result of the season. Singapore, a double retirement. Mexico, a retirement for Alonso and a lowly 14th for Jenson Button. So not counting the failures to start, of which there were 2, Magnussen in Australia and Button in Bahrain, the total retirements for the MP430 in all the races in which it started are as follows. Malaysia, 2. Spain, that's a 3rd. Monaco, a 4th. Canada, 5th and 6th. Austria, 7th and 8th. Britain, a 9th retirement. Singapore, 10th and 11th. Mexico, a 12th. So 12 retirements out of all of the race starts in 19 rounds for the MP430. That's pretty pitiful. And of course, in the races where it actually did manage to finish, well, that 5th place in Hungary, courtesy of Alonso, and then that 9th in Hungary, courtesy of Button, that was the car's cumulative best result of the season. It's pretty awful. On the balance of the season, McLaren scored 27 constructors' points, netting them 9th in the championship. McLaren is the second most successful team in Formula One history. 9th in the championship, with the Honda engine, which was heralded as being probably one of the more competitive going into the season. Well, no. That was not going to happen. Honda, of course, they were resting on their laurels of the late 80s and early 90s, that magic combination of McLaren, Honda, Ayrton Senna, Alain Prost, and Gerhard Berger, of course, winning the Constructors' Championship a couple of times, winning the Drivers' Championship a couple of times. They were thinking, hey, this is going to be fantastic. It's going to be just like the old days. No. As always, Formula One moves on pretty much day by day. These cars are only current for one day on the balance of everything. And Honda just failed to calculate all of that. Didn't work. Didn't work at all. Instead, they built a GP2 engine, which only ever went into Fernando's car, consequently, but there it was. So in terms of competition history, certainly not a car that we want to remember, and it's not one that we remember fondly. But because it was so terrible, and in my opinion this is the biggest laughingstock to come out of Formula One in the past decade, that's why we remember the MP430. Now let's take a look at what AutoArt have done in terms of this 1/18th scale MP430 for the sake of it being the model that it is. Now, as far as I go with my car collection and what I've seen and what I've had in the past and what I have presently, this model by AutoArt, it's only the second AutoArt that I have ever had, and it's only the second AutoArt that I've ever seen up close. The other AutoArt example in my collection happens to be a fictional car. It is the 2014 Red Bull X 2014 Concept, that series of cars designed by Adrian Newey for the Gran Turismo console video game series. And that model is actually very, very good. However, because it's a fictional car, we can't really say how authentic it is in terms of its detail because the car doesn't actually exist. This one, however, being very much modeled after a real-world car, yep, we can talk about the quality and overall accuracy of everything. One of the things that really sets this one apart in my mind is the detail on the front wing, and we'll get some closer-in shots of this later on. But the front wing, as you can see here, of course, not as complicated as the wings that we currently see in F1, but for its time, definitely one of the more complicated ones. And as far as models are concerned, well, this one is very good. Unlike some of the wings that we have seen on the Mini Champs cars, well, this one actually has separate elements in all of the wing flaps there. You can see that we've got slot gaps between all of the wing elements. They're real. They're not just painted that way. There's not silver or white paint there to sort of create a false contrast. No, you are actually seeing separate wing elements there. So that's very good. The wing itself, the sizing and angles of everything looks just about right. And, well, yeah, there you go. Of course, pretty complicated as far as aerodynamics were concerned in this era. Not counting the main plane, we have got 4 flaps here on the upper flap section of the wing, and then of course we've got these cascades which have more or less been banned for the 2019 rules, but you can see that we have got more flap elements in there. I'm counting 3 horizontal flap elements there, and then we've got more subdivisions there, 3 of them running vertically. on the cascades on each side. So that's pretty cool, and again, I'm very impressed with that. The main plane itself is actually subdivided into two separate flap elements, so we've got a lower flap there and then an upper middle flap there for what I would assume we could call the proper main plane of the wing. Basically, the only solid and flat section of this wing is that homologated neutral section just underneath the nose there, and that's, of course, per the regulations. But the rest of it, yes, very intricately modeled, and AutoArt definitely did a very nice job on that. Additionally, moving up on the car, you can see the front suspension there, our wishbones running horizontally, and then the push rods coming up at about 45 degrees into the monocoque. So very nice detail in there as well. Also, brake duct detail here on each side. Yes, very complicated brake ducts, which the FIA eventually decided to simplify for 2019 and 2020, but, well, there it was in 2015. So McLaren, of course, they have long been industry leaders in aerodynamics and overall component design, and it shows here on the MP430. Again, really the weak part of this car was the engine. Unfortunately, Honda just completely out of their element in terms of what the expectations had to be to really get that proper performance for Formula One in the turbo hybrid era, and even taking that year just to observe the championship for 2014 to see how everybody else got on with these engines. They were well off the mark, and really that's what held this car back. The GP2 comment that Fernando Alonso made at Suzuka, that really came from the fact that they were being overtaken in a straight line by Toro Rossos, all right? So if you're talking about a good engine, it at least has to have good straight line speed, but it didn't even have that much. And not only that, but the hybrid system, honestly, it didn't know the difference between accelerating and braking. I don't recall specifically if this was 2015, but I seem to remember a qualifying session for the Belgian Grand Prix in the McLaren Honda days when the car went into regen mode through Pujon because it didn't know that it was trying to deploy rather than regen. So even going through corners where, generally speaking, everything should be flat out, a corner like Pujon in the modern cars, it's flat out. Nope, the Hondas were trying to regen through there. So big time problems with the engine management, with the engine itself, just in terms of what it was doing or not doing. But yeah, decent detail so far, at least on the front end of this car. Along the sides here, well, this is where those basically 2009 to 2016 regulations really were the most dramatic departure from what we had in the days of yore. Very quiet as far as most of the detail is concerned. You can see along the midsection of the front end, we really don't have much in the way of barge board detail, and this was by design. Those 2009 regulations, for the most part, outlawed barge boards, at least as we had known them to that point. We still do have some vestigial barge boards in this section. It's a little bit difficult to see from this angle simply because the car is mostly black. However, some small barge board detail going on there, and of course, the tongue T-tray section of the floor with its little stay there going from the bottom of the chassis down to the floor itself. Very visible, but for the most part, very quiet. Just see a little turning vane just to the side of the cockpit in front of the side pod opening, and then the floor section comes in again with that little upturn just to keep some air from spilling out over the side. Very quiet along the side pod length to the floor and the rear section of the car. Again, with the switch to the turbo V6s, we no longer have two banks of engine exhaust, everything exhausting out topside and through the middle, so no more blown diffusers or anything like that, but still trying to keep the car as svelte and slim as possible to get more space to funnel air toward the top side of the rear zone to blow the diffuser that way. Unfortunately, not very effective on any of the cars, the McLaren notwithstanding, but certainly the McLaren was among the worst, if not the worst, in that regard as well, simply because Honda had a lot of packaging constraints that they really couldn't work around in terms of trying to keep the engine happy. Honda, being a first-generation engine builder for 2015, they didn't have that extra year of experience that everybody else had, so they were starting from zero, a year out of sync with everybody else, and unfortunately it showed in many regards. But along the side here, detail-wise, very nice. Of course, things are just pretty sparse because that's what the rules were, but very nice in terms of what is here. I like the wheel and tire detail here. Nice graphics there on the tire. There's your wheel. Very nice. I like the gold wheel nut there, and of course the wheel itself.
painted black. You can see inside there the brake disc and caliper detail, very nice, and nice graphics on the sides of the tire as well. Coming back toward the rear, there's the rear wheel and all of that. That looks very nice. And the rear wing end fence. The gills there in the top section of the end fence, and then the little striations coming down, hanging down from the side of the end fence toward the ground. Very nice to see those little subdivisions in that. And of course there are some more there, but from our angle right now it's blocked by that rear tire. But very nice all in all, and nice little stick-on aero vanes as well across the fin section of the end fence there. Very, very cool to see all of that. Also, in terms of the profile view here, nice to see the graphics along the side of the engine cover, the very, very few sponsors there, and of course the big Honda logo. There's your SO branding, Mobile 1, and then the emergency kill switch for the marshal should the car not be able to be shut down on track. Jensen Button's name, all of that. Very nice detail there graphics-wise on this model. And the rear zone on the MP430, well, this is just a sign of the times. There's our rear suspension there, the double wishbone pull rod arrangement. You can see the pull rods coming in from equal and opposite angles basically to what we saw on the front end, because obviously we're applying a force in this direction rather than in this direction. However, you can see the geometries there, nicely recreated by Auto Art. Of course, down the center line of the car, there's your rear wing, and then the central exhaust there for the V6 engine. Pretty much everybody running more or less this configuration. What I don't see here are any modeling of the wastegate pipes, and offhand I can't remember how Honda were actually doing that. We've seen some teams run 2 pipes above the center exhaust. We've seen the teams run one pipe to each side of that center exhaust, but not seeing anything like that here on what Auto Art have chosen to do. What you do see, though, is you see this little stay around the exhaust pipe there, and in the center there, that little stay going down from the top of the engine cover in terms of that central tunnel coming out, just exhausting some more hot air there, probably from the intercooler if I had to be a betting man. Rear wing, there you go. No beam wing to speak of. That was another thing that we got away from in 2014. And then pulling back a little bit farther, there is our diffuser. Very simple diffuser in terms of what we've seen in the past. Just a single level diffuser, and actually quite short. Very small gap for the air to be expanding out of. There's the top of the reference plane, and then there's the ground. So you can just see some small vanes coming down from the top of the diffuser toward the ground, and there it was. Basically, not all that much room to be manipulating the airflow, and that's one of the things that severely limited the rear downforce on these cars, particularly through high-speed corners. And of course, that was not helped by the tires being the sizes that they were in this era. Very narrow tires, especially when we're talking about an open-wheel race car. So we saw these drivers having to be so careful, particularly under traction from the acceleration zones at a low-speed corners, and even in high-speed corners, the cars just didn't have all that much grip. They did have a lot of straight-line speed because they didn't have all that much downforce, relatively speaking. So places like Monza or Mexico, we readily saw them breaking 220 miles an hour, sometimes even faster than that in some cases. But the high-speed grip, and in my opinion, that's one of the things that really differentiates a Formula One car or a top-level open-wheeled car from other disciplines of racing. These cars just didn't really have them, and particularly in places like Silverstone, for example, where we're so used to seeing these really dramatic shots of them going basically flat out through Copse Corner or through the Maggots and Beckett's complex later on. These cars didn't do that so much, and a lot of people, myself included in this era, were saying, why are we seeing Formula One cars going so visibly slower? And eventually the FIA agreed with us and gave us the 2017 rules package, which was an absolute triumph in my opinion. And thankfully we're going to get one more year of that in 2020 before we go on to the big sea of unknown variables in 2021. But again, that should be interesting as well. But as far as this era 5 years ago, this is what we were talking about, and I don't think that history will be so kind to this rules package because, well, they were quite a lot slower than what we had been seeing even in 2013. So, yes, but as the way of the world is, things change and we make mistakes and we learn from them and then we hopefully improve later. Now for some shots from closer up here. There's that front wing that we were talking about earlier, and I've got to say, they did a really great job over at Auto Art modeling this wing. I mean, just take a look at how intricate all of those little flap elements are, and they are all properly flaps in their own right. There's no trickery going on with the paint. You can see clear through the wing there. You can even see the little vortex generators underneath the flaps. Very, very cool. You can see the little stays that are there to keep everything as rigid as they reasonably can. Very nice to see all of that. And again, this is among some of the best wing detail I've had on a Formula One model to date. So very nice. You can even see the little carbon fiber texturing work that they have done there on the wing flaps. Absolutely awesome. The middle section of the wing there, the neutral section, you can see there, it's blocked by the big nose here, but there are the decals there through the center section, which is neutralized per the regulations, and then getting underneath the wing there. You can see how they've done everything there with the detail of the pylons attaching the wing to the nose. Very cool. And of course the little graphics there. Very cool. There are the cascade elements there on the outboard side of the wing here on car right. You can just see how intricate they are. Very, very cool to see all of that. Sponsorship on the nose, nice decal there. And again, I was actually a fan of this nose on the car. I know it looks very, very big, and it is very, very big, and eventually McLaren decided to go to a more conventional nowadays thumbnail nose, but there it was at launch spec and the beginning of the season. I do like how crisp everything is sponsorship-wise. Very, very cool. Front suspension decal, there it is. Faux carbon fiber look on the camera mounts there on either side of the nose, as well as on the suspension arms there. Very nice brake duct detail as well, very intricately shaped there to try and get air into the brake to cool them, but also to condition that airflow around the tire and front suspension as we start to push it rearward there toward the radiator openings. Very cool. Other side of the suspension. Here is the first of a couple of faults that I will point out on the model. Here is the right-hand brake duct, and you can see how it's not really sitting flush against the wheel. Looking at the left-hand side, it's much straighter. It's not quite up against the wheel either, because it really shouldn't be. Otherwise, you'd get tire rub. But there it is, much straighter on car left than it is on car right. So a little bit of a fault, I will say, in assembly on this model so far. But top side, there you go. There's your pitot array for your sensors and instrumentation. Very cool. And then the nice sloping line down to the nose tip. I do like all of that very much. There's Jensen buttons number 22, and then the shut lines there for the vanity panel over the nose, covering up the step there in the monocoque. Up top side toward the cockpit, there is our second aerial, which might be a little bit difficult to see in this shot because we don't have much of a reference, but you can see that it is a little bit crooked there. That doesn't really detract from the appearance of the car because, of course, these aerials in real life are very flexible and we do often see them crooked on the real cars, but there it was, crooked there on the auto art rendition of this model. But also taking a look through here, through the center section of the monocoque, you can see just how reflective the paintwork is. It does look very nice, and I've got to say, well, it does show up some of the little dust that has settled on the car just having it out there, but does look very nice. The paint applied very, very nicely. Also, I'll say here, the car is not 100% die-cast. In fact, I would say it's mostly not die-cast. This is a resin composite model. There are some die-cast details on it. For example, the rear crash structure is actually die-cast, strangely enough. But most of the car is that resin material, and I'm not a big fan of resin models, but this one actually works very nicely. And of course, the real car would not be metal by any means. It's mostly carbon fiber. So yeah, it works, and that paint application across the resin is just a smoother material than most die-cast metal, and I think that shows up in that mirror-like quality of the paint. So it looks very nice. Looking into the cockpit on the 430, there's Jensen Button there. His helmet rendered very nicely in terms of the graphics there. And there is the cockpit detail. The steering wheel on this car, well, definitely not one of the better steering wheels that I have seen on a Formula One model. It's not bad, but it looks a little bit too big, first of all. And aside from that, it doesn't have nearly as many details on it as it really could have. Again, if you've driven this car in iRacing, you know exactly what that steering wheel looks like. And, well, I've seen a lot better on model cars. But there it is. And it does turn a little bit with the front wheels there. Again, it's not the easiest thing to demonstrate because the steering does work on this car, as you can see. But really, it's very, very slack. You can see the steering control arm there going through the monocoque as I rotate the wheels there by hand, but it doesn't really rotate the steering wheel very much, which is a little disappointing, but hey, we do have operable steering on the car nonetheless. Rest of the cockpit, well, not too much in the way of detail as far as any decals on the side of the cockpit there, no FIA homologation stickers or anything of that sort. But we do have some reasonable detail of Jensen Button's helmet, as we've seen, as well as on the suit. Mostly white, but nice seatbelt detail nonetheless, with that faux fabric look. They are just plastic seatbelts in there, but again, they have some 3D depth to them, so that's cool. They are not stickers by any means. There's that central buckle and all of that. Looks pretty nice. Back of the steering wheel, you can see that we have some attempt at replicating paddles there, so that's not too bad. In addition to the top of the monocoque, there's the neutral switch there for the marshals or the driver to actuate should the car become stuck in gear out on track. And then the status light for the hybrid system. If that's red, stay away. If that's green, then the car is safe to approach. Toward the top side of the engine cover, there we go. More details here, and this is actually very nice. I've only got a couple other models that go this far in terms of rendering small details like this. You can see here this little ring against the emergency kill switch. That is the little ring that the marshals would pull if they need to shut this car down from the outside, and there it is. That's actually rendered nicely on both sides, as you can see there, so that's very cool. And additionally, the graphics that we talked about earlier, there they are a little bit closer up, and they do look very crisp even at close range. So all of that is very nice. Decent shut lines along the bodywork here, along the side pods in the engine cover where it links up with the other sections of bodywork. Very cool. And then looking at the rear suspension from above, there it is, your wishbones there, and then the pull rods coming up through the rear zone. There we go. Now, the die-cast detail on this mostly resin car, the rear crash structure here, that is actually die-cast, believe it or not. I'm not entirely sure why it is, but it is. And then the exhaust also done in die-cast. So interesting notes there. So this part is metal here. And then the exhaust actually is metal. Otherwise, everything else is mostly resin on this model, which isn't bad, but it's just interesting material choices in obscure places. I don't know if they decided just to make that smaller detail out of metal to save money in terms of model production or what, but that's what they did, and well, it works. Other detail on this car that, well, it's absent on this car that we have on the BBRs, for example. DRS, obviously you can see the actuator pod for the DRS here with its little strut. However, the DRS is not operable at all, so it's just fixed. Again, that would have been something nice to put in place, but the detail that is here is done very nicely. There's the little hydraulic strut going up into the wing, carrying the hydraulic lines to actuate the DRS on that rear wing. And then the rear wing detail itself with the little gills that are cut into the tops of the wing. That is actually a cut in there. It's not a detail that's done with decals or with paint. That is just an actual gill cut through there. And then, of course, the side of the wing as well. Nicely done there with all of the little stick-on wing elements. And then the gills coming down the bottom side of the end fence. Very nicely done, I must say. Tires, they are not the super shiny slick tires that you would see on a Mattel model, for example. They've been scuffed up to look like they've been driven on. Very nice. And the rubber itself, it's very nicely done. They're pretty hard, but they are rubber, and I do like the way that they've scuffed them up just to give them the appearance of being worn a little bit. So that works nicely. And of course, the rear wheel detail in there again. There's your brake disc detail inside, and then the lettering on the side of the tire. Very cool. No embossed lettering in there in terms of being able to see tire specifications like you'd see on the BBR cars, but very nicely done nonetheless, and it does look representative of what we were seeing closer in on the rear section of the floor there. There's that little fin heading toward the radiator, and then that faux carbon finish goes all the way along the floor toward the turning vane area again, and then toward the middle section of the car. Very, very cool. Other bits of detail that I will point out. Take a look inside the side pod there. You can see that we do have those pleats in the radiator matrices. An attempt to do that at very least, but again, I'd expect them to be metallic, but they're not metallic, but the detail is there nonetheless, so good effort there by Auto Art. The other very conspicuous fault that I will point out there, take a look at that T-wing, the camera mount there. Definitely not what I would be looking for. Very, very crooked, very noticeable, and in my opinion, it does detract from the overall presentation value of the model, but there it is. Again, this is not something that's all that uncommonly seen on Formula One models, but again, Auto Art, they really do present themselves as being in the higher end of the scale model manufacturers, and for them to do something like that, well, it really does just exude cheapness and cost cutting. So come on, guys, fix that. Aside from that, though, you can see the detail inside the snorkel there, the little vein running horizontally roughly halfway up that triangular section of the snorkel. You can see where they're splitting the airflow, some of that going into the engine intake and some of that probably going to cool something else, but you can see that there. It's also evident on many external shots of the car when we did see it on track. So cool to see all of that as well. But for the most part, it's certainly not a bad model by any means. There are just a couple of things in it that I would say revisit that. I don't know if perhaps this was an earlier version and they fixed some of those errors, but you know, it detracts from the overall presentation quality slightly. And I mean, we remember this car for being comically bad on track, and I don't think we really need to have any comically bad, simple, silly errors in terms of model production to detract from its overall appearance. But I mean, all in all, what do you want? It's a model of the McHonda, and basically I just have it because I want to laugh at it, so we can laugh at it for a couple more things aside from the car's real-world pedigree. And the last detail here, the underside of the car. There's that front wing that we talked about earlier, and you can see clear through it. So again, that does prove that it is actually separate elements in there through there. Patent pending underneath the front suspension. So that's interesting. I wonder if they ever got that patent. And then the under tray of the car. There's the information about it. Auto Art 118 McLaren MP430 F1. Crafted in China, not made in China, it was crafted. Alrighty then, fix the T-wing, China. Anyway, there is your diffuser outlet there at the back, and then that faux carbon fiber look throughout the entire under tray of the car. Also, here is the central plank on the car, the step plane there, and then the reference plane outboard. This is the very bottom of the car. Alright, decent hardware details there, just rendering there pressed into the plastic. However, this should be that cream-colored wood, or wood composite material rather, and it's not, it's just black. So you cheaped out here as well, unfortunately, Auto Art. Why? I don't know, but they did. But I know that some of you rather like to see the undersides of these models, and there it is on the MP430. Again, some more detail that they could have included here, and they chose not to, but there it was.
So there it is, the McLaren MP430, rendered in 1/18th scale by Auto Art. Again, as I mentioned, it's only the second Auto Art model that I've had, and it's the first Auto Art model of an actual car that I've had. So a little bit of a shot in the dark quality-wise, as far as I'm concerned. Auto Art, they do market themselves as a purveyor of higher-end scale models, and I've got to say, it mostly is on the mark here on the MP430, but again, those application flaws that I pointed out of the antenna array, as well as on that T-cam, that camera mount for the onboard camera there, being oh so crooked, it honestly reminds me of some mid-2000s Mattel workmanship as far as the quality is concerned. So for something that's as simple as that, come on, take the time to line it up properly, because if you're going to be selling these cars for $150, $200 US, I think we deserve a straight camera mount. But aside from that, the detail that I have seen on the car, particularly that front wing, that's got to be the highlight on this car. It's just rendered so intricately and accurately. It's a little bit of a pity that we don't have the later season version of the car here modeled, but for what it is, this is the car as it appeared during launch as well as in the first few rounds of the season. I also have to say I rather liked the initial launch spec livery that McLaren put on this car, the mostly silver topside bodywork with the red and black accents. That looked good. The car didn't really race very much in that overall configuration in terms of livery. They did revert to this livery pretty early on, but I do like what they did, and of course, more or less, aside from the nose, this is also how the car appears in iRacing, so we've got a lot of seat time in that car in sim racing, and it's really cool to have a model of something that you've driven extensively in the sim world, because I think you just identify with it a little bit more, and it gives you a little bit more insight in terms of what you're holding in your hand. So I do like all of that, and of course, if you haven't seen my tongue-in-cheek revisit of the MP430 in iRacing, do take a look at that as well, because I think we had some fun in there, and we also delved into some more of the technical side in terms of why this car is just so absolutely dreadful to look at and drive. But for the most part, that is what we have got from Auto Art here. It's a cool model. Again, would I recommend it? Well, If you like the McLaren Honda story of the mid-2010s, if you want to relive in excruciating detail every facet of the disaster that it was, definitely this car deserves a place in your Formula One collection. I mean, you got a car that's driven by Jenson Button and Fernando Alonso, pair of world champions there, McLaren being the second most successful team in Formula One history. It's got provenance behind it, but for the most part, if you were watching Formula One in those years and you remember the cataclysm of misfortune that McLaren and Honda had to attempt to overcome and ultimately failed in so doing, it's definitely one that deserves a place in your collection. Auto art, I think I can say I expected better in terms of the overall build quality. But for what it is, it's fair. The paint looks nice. The overall detail macrocosmically on the car looks nice. And again, you do get that great front wing, which for me definitely has to be the highlight on this one. I do hope you enjoyed this one, though. Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you all very much for watching. And of course, we will see you soon.